This is for medieval art, Art H4027, and it is High Gothic art in France, Reims Cathedral. Continuing with the High Gothic in France, we want to look at Reims Cathedral, like Notre-Dame du Chartres or Notre-Dame du Amiens. It's Notre-Dame du Reims. And it's also Reims Cathedral, so you can call it either one. The dedication is to Notre-Dame, Our Lady, to the Virgin Mary, but it is the cathedral or bishop's church in the town of Reims. Now, this is a predominantly 13th century building. It's begun around 1225. It was finished 1311. And so this is, a beautiful example of High Gothic architecture and High Gothic sculpture. The foundation was laid in 1211. The west facade was built between 1225 and 1311. And you can see some of the, the Gothic characteristics of the facade. It is a two-tower facade. Both of the towers were built. And you see all of those verticals in it, these very tall, thin vertical elements from the lancet windows and little niches with sculpture under it and perforations in the building. So many, many verticals pointing upwards. The rose windows have that thin bar tracery. In other words, less stone, more glass, which we expect from the 13th century. And you can see they have the rose window, in the place that it becomes traditional for the Gothics, or the second level above the portals, right above the central portal. But you also have additional rose windows. An additional rose window over the doorway of the central portal. So instead of a tympanum, we have a rose window there. And then the sculpture that you might expect to see in the tympanum is actually placed on the top of the gables that are over the entranceways. Now, as we'll see, those have been very worn with time, and they've been replaced with replicas. And the originals have been moved into museums. You also can see the flying buttresses. Here we have the east end of the choir, and you can see how each little chapel meets the other. There's a buttress between them, and then if you look up, you see the flying buttresses at the levels above the window level of the apse of the choir. And here we're looking at the rose. This is the rose of the second level, and it has that very thin, as we said, bar tracery, so you can just see it from the outside and also see it from the inside with the glass and the light coming through the colored glass with the thin bar tracery. And here are the portals. And you see you have another rose window over the central portal, and you also have glass over the side portals. And the sculpture, rather than being in the tympanum, of course you have sculpture in the voussoirs, and as we'll see, you have sculpture in the jambs, but the sculpture that you might expect to be in the tympanum has actually been moved up to the gables. The porches are very, very deep, and so we have sculpture that we'll take a look at in the jambs. Now here we're looking at the sculpture of the central portal, which is the coronation of the Virgin. And you can see that we have a picture here of the original, which has been worn down because it was outside all, for centuries. And then they've placed a replica on the outside of the church. So you can see both of them here and compare. And you have a Marian theme in the central portal. The north portal is the Crucifixion. But the central portal is, follows through this Marian theme with the rose window, which we associate with Mary, with the coronation of the Virgin. She has arrived in heaven and she is being crowned Queen of Heaven. And then in the jam statues, we have an infancy cycle. That means the infancy of Christ, which of course includes Mary, his mother. In the north jams, or the left side as we look at it, there's a presentation in the temple. And in the south side of the central portal, or the right as we're looking at, as we're facing it, you have two scenes, the Annunciation and the Visitation. And we want to take a look at these. But first we're going to look inside the church. And you're going to look first at the plan, see how it's all laid out. It's a cruciform plan, but once again, as you've seen with, say, Amiens, with some of these high Gothic churches, the transept that forms the cross bar is absorbed into the choir. So you have, as you're coming down the nave, you have the nave, the central aisle, and then one aisle on either side, two side aisles. You get to the transept, and there's a little bump out, as it were, which has the doorways on either side, and you have what looks like the nave, and then it looks like two side aisles. One is the transept, and then that continues up into the choir. And then, of course, we have the easternmost end with, you can see, 5 radiating chapels, all of which share a single wall between them. We've already looked at that on the outside. We can see there's buttresses between the chapels, that forms the wall essentially, and then the flying buttresses overhead. You could also see the quadripartite, or 4-part ribbed vaults, 4 parts because you have the transverse or diaphragm arches that go straight across and mark a single bay or section of the church, and then the ribs crisscross, they form a kind of X, and within that you can count 4 of these triangular shapes on the plan. Now, we're looking into the nave, down the nave, toward the western side. And of course, the west is where the doorway is. Churches are generally oriented, so the east is the altar end, and the west is the entrance. So here we have the view toward the west, where you see the 2 great rose windows and the lancet windows that are beneath the upper rows. And then you have the view toward the east with the choir and the chapels. Some of the things you'll notice, talk about Gothic characteristics, are the verticality, the pointed arches that reach toward heaven, the multiplication of these shafts or colonnettes as they rise up and divide the nave wall vertically. They go vertically. You also have, of course, the 3-part elevation with the arcade, triforium, and clerestory. As you get closer to the choir, the proportions of the bays become narrower, and that makes it appear to be even more vertical. There you see the colored light, and here you see the eastern end. Now we're looking up, so you can see the quadripartite ribbed vault. You can see these bosses. That's the round stonework where the ribs intersect, and of course those help to hold the ribs in place. They help with the thrust of the building. And here we're looking more toward the wall, so you can see the arcade. You can see the triforium. And then, of course, very large clerestory windows, many of which have lost their glass. Stained glass is very breakable. And so many times in the churches, the glass is either not original or they've just been replaced with clear glass, as you can see some of that here. And here we're looking up into the nave elevation, the three-part elevation, arcade, triforium, and you can see how the triforium is very shallow. You've got a wall behind it, but it's not a blind arcade. It's not right up there. There's a little bit of space that somebody could walk up there and, do repairs, fix things. It's not where people would stand during the services, though. It's not like a gallery. It's much smaller. And of course, the entire third level is taken up with the glass. Although no longer does it have its stained glass. It's now, in many places, clear glass. Now, let's look at some of the details here, where you have the piers, which they're supporting a lot of weight, so they're the heaviest part. This is the columns between each of the arcade openings. But to make them seem lighter, you have engaged columns, and in this case, you have a compound pier with 4 engaged columns attached to the pier. And then at the next level, you have a multiple colonnettes that rise up to the springing of the vault, giving it that vertical appearance. As they always say, the church seems to rise toward heaven. You're supposed to feel literally uplifted. Now, I want to take a look at the nave capitals at Reims. These are foliate capitals. In other words, they're leafy. They show their foliage. They're different designs that look like leaves. And you'll notice something interesting about them. The capitals have the same height, whether it is the pier itself or the engaged columns that are attached to the pier. So what that means is you have a kind of band. In many of the other churches, of course, because the pier is larger, you have a larger capital. The colonnettes are smaller, you have a smaller capital. But because they are the same width, you have this visual band of the carving that unifies the columns and unifies the nave. It's also, because it's a characteristic of Reims Cathedral, it also helps you if you're looking at a picture of a Gothic church and you're saying, okay, which one is it? Okay, it seems to be high Gothic. How do I know? Is it Amiens or Chartres or Reims or whatever? Well, this helps you to identify Reims. And I think students often do wonder, how can I tell one Gothic cathedral from another? At first glance, you might say, gee, they all look alike. They've got, 3-story elevations and all these pointed arches. And, how can I tell them apart? Well, it helps if you identify specific details in the nave or in the facade that characterize the individual church. And for example, when we looked at Amiens Cathedral, we talked about that foliate string course, the horizontal band that extends down the length of the nave, which is unique to Amiens. And here at Reims, the capitals that are equal in height for both the pier and the columns, the colonnettes on the pier, form that visual band. And it's different than the capitals at Amiens or at Chartres, where the capitals of the engaged columns are much smaller. So this is one of the characteristics that will help you identify Reims Cathedral if you're looking at the interior. Here you see a close-up just of one pier. And here's the elevation and the drawing. We've already talked about the three-part elevation. Here we see more details looking upward, giving you that sense of verticality. And now we're looking at the side aisles, which of course are lower, but they also have the pointed ribbed groin vaults. And as you can see, they also have the capitals that form the band, where the capitals of the colonnette or the engaged columns are the same width as the capital of the piers, or the larger column that supports the nave arcade. Well, it supports the church in many ways. Okay, let's go outside again. Promise to show you some sculpture. So we're looking at the portals on the entrance, or the west facade, the west portals, and we're going to look at the central portal. I want to make a few generalizations about Gothic sculpture. One of the things you'll see is that Gothic sculpture is more natural or naturalistic than Romanesque sculpture. Most Romanesque sculpture, and there are exceptions, most Romanesque sculptures seem to be abstracted. So think about Giselberta's tympana at Autun, the Last Judgment, or the tympanum at Santa Madeleine, at Vézelay, with all of this wonderful energy and stretched out forms, and forms that just fit the architecture, but very abstract. I want to be real clear about this. Every once in a while, I have students that sort of talk about abstraction as though it's not right, it's wrong. And it's not wrong, it's wonderful. It's a different artistic choice. But, there is so much meaning and so many ways to convey the concepts. And artists make different choices, and different periods have different choices. Now, I said that there's not all works done during the Romanesque period have this abstraction. Think of Rainier of Hue and the baptismal font at Liège. It seems so unusual. It obviously shows classical influence, and is much more natural than most other things done at the same time. But as a general rule, most Gothic sculpture is more natural than Romanesque sculpture, which is more abstract. And you can see this developing if you start with, say, the jam statues at Saint-Denis, and then at the west facade of Chartres. And then, as we said, we'll keep looking at Gothic sculpture, and we're going to look at some right now, the Thai Gothic. And one of the other characteristics is that Gothic sculpture becomes more independent of the architecture than Romanesque sculpture. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about the Romanesque sculpture, how all the figures would be, some of them would be large, such as Christ in the center of a tympana. Some of them be small or hunched over, so they could fit into the architecture. Jam statues would be, curved. Well, I'm thinking of the ones at Moissac, for example, curve around and fit the jam. We start to see more independence of the architecture with Gothic sculpture. And this is part of becoming more natural looking, or more believable. And if you look at the early Gothic jam statues, think of Saint-Denis or Chartres, they have characteristics that look more realistic, but they still are pretty columnar. They sort of a cylinder. They're jam columns that have become figures, in a sense. Well, we're going to see what happens here, where we have jam statues that really are independent of the shape of the column. In other words, they're not cylindrical. They're the shapes of human figures. And they actually stand in front of the jam column. So here we're looking at some of the jam statues from the west portal at Reims, in the central portal on the west facade. And you can see that we have these little colonnettes, but the figures just are standing on their little pedestals sort of out in front. And these are the jam statues. Now, on this case, we're seeing two scenes, each one made up of two figures. The Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel tells Mary that she will bear the Christ child. So you have an angel and you have Mary. And then right next to it is the Visitation, where Mary, pregnant with the Christ child, goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. And in the Bible, Mary sings what we call the Magnificat. It is one of the canticles of the church. My soul doth magnify the Lord. And John the Baptist leaps in his mother's womb. He's recognizing the Christ child even before they're born. Now, one of the things that I want to talk to you about is the style. And I think when you look at these, you've probably noticed that there's three different styles in these four figures. The angel is different than the angel Annunciate is different than the Virgin Annunciate. And then there's similar characteristics with the Virgin Mary and Elizabeth in the Visitation. Now, let's look at some details. Here we're looking at just the angel and Mary. And here a little close-up from the side, and you can see how the angel is leaning out from the wall. The wings are coming. They're not just part of the wall. They can lean out. They seem to have the sensation that they could move, perhaps. When we look just at the Annunciation, we see two different artists. On the west facade of Reims, we're seeing three basic styles of jam statues that are created by different masters and possibly at slightly different times, although it would be possible that you could have artists with two different styles working side by side, working at approximately the same time. For example, you might have an older master who's continuing the style from his youth, and a younger master who's doing what is very, very current or something like that. Now, we do date them slightly differently because the style does allow for that. And I should also point out that the style allows art historians to identify where the artist worked maybe previously. For example, the Virgin Annunciate, which we think is around 1230, has the same style as some of the sculpture at Amiens. So we think that this artist, the Amiens master, worked at Amiens and then worked at Reims. Or at least, members of his workshop. But that's how masons would have had to have worked. If there was a cathedral that was being built, and of course they take many decades, sometimes a whole century or more to build a church. If the work continues, the artist could live there his whole life. But what if there's an interruption in the work? Let's say they run out of funds, or the building campaign does not go on. Or if in the case of an artist who specializes in sculpture, rather than just the builders, rather than the builders, because the masons may have different specialties. Maybe they finish up the sculpture at one church and then they move on to another church. They have to go where the work is. And sometimes, we can see, where they worked before. We saw that with Romanesque art, and you can see it with Gothic art as well. So we think that the artist who created the Virgin Annunciate worked at Amiens previously. You'll notice that the Virgin Mary has very simple vertical folds in her drapery. The folds are somewhat tube-like, not as much as Romanesque. They're much more believable. There's some variations. They're not just grooves, but they do fall in very simple forms. And you can see they form this great V down the front of the front of her tunic, right over her womb, actually. Maybe it's drawing attention to that. Her features are very calm. Someone's called them bland. Maybe a little pinched looking, but very simple, dignified image of the Virgin Mary that once again suggests she's a virgin, so maybe that's appropriate. Now the angel is by a different hand entirely. And we think he was probably carved a little bit later. We think maybe 1245 to 1255. So around 1250, give or take. And there's something else about him. He was not originally on the central portal of the west facade. He was moved from the north portal. We know that because there are installation marks on the back that show where it was supposed to be placed. And so it's moved from the north portal of the west facade down on the left side to its present location. Why? Well, we don't know why. Nobody left us a note telling us why. We can imagine various possibilities. Maybe the Amiens master created both an angel and the Virgin Mary, but the statue of the angel was damaged in some way, so they needed to replace it. And rather than have someone carve an entirely new angel, they said, well, we have these beautiful angels over here, let's just move it over. Or maybe we might hypothesize that that the Amiens master is an older master. Maybe he died before he got his angel done. And so once again, maybe they decided to move it. Or maybe somebody just thought this would look good there. We don't know why, but they did move it. It was not originally supposed to be part of this composition. Now, the angel is the epitome of what we mean when we say high Gothic. It's courtly, elegant, somewhat elongated, and there's this very graceful curve of the draperies. And you'll see how the cloak is pulled up on one side and cascades down. So we want to take a look at this angel. He's been called the smiling angel. It's the angel Gabriel, but he is smiling. He's got this, little dimpled smile, or, is it even a smirk? In this context, it's almost like, hi, I've got a message for you. You're going to have a baby. It's going to be a really wonderful baby. But there he is. He's courtly, he's elegant, he's fashionable, he's slender and graceful and elongated. His draperies fall in beautiful cascades, in curves. And, we've seen that growing naturalism of Gothic sculpture. Now, in this case, it's idealized according to the courtly ideal. And you can even see that little bend of the wrist, which you'll see an angel similar to this in some of the manuscripts we show you. And here we're looking Cut him from another view, you'll notice it's as though one of the hips is raised up. We sometimes call that the hip shot position. So it gives you a kind of turn, a little bit exaggerated perhaps, with the hip rising. And that allows the draperies to have a reason to fall in these graceful folds. And once again, sort of the epitome of the high Gothic style with the graceful sweep of drapery. And there you can see him up close. You see his smile. You can also see how his cheeks are raised up, and the eyes are squinting a little as he's grinning. He's got this lovely curling locks of hair, and you can see the detail of the wings. This kind of little figure, though, I would say he's a page boy from heaven. Page boys had to bring messages, so, he's bringing the message. So you see the idea of Gothic naturalism. In this case, the naturalism includes this courtly ideal. You see the holy figures becoming, in this case, it's a spiritual being, looking more human in a sense, even with human emotion. So he's a charming, fashionable, elegant figure. He's the courtly ideal, the page boy from heaven, as it were. How different is the style of the two figures of the Visitation? We think that these date just a little bit later than the Mary of the Annunciation. So about 1230, and maybe a little bit later, maybe 1233. This story is told in Luke 1, 39 to 56. As I said, it's when Mary, pregnant with the Christ child, visits her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. They're still jam statues, but once again, they're standing out in front of the columns. They don't look like columns themselves. They've got their own little pedestal. You feel like you could take them and move them around, literally, just as the angel was moved around. And what is particularly noticeable is the influence of classical antiquity. They look like Roman matrons. They're wearing classical draperies that are bunched into a myriad of complex folds that wrap the body, or they cling to parts of the body, like the knees or the elbows, which suggests the form of the body beneath. You can also see Mary's, hip is being pulled up, so the draperies are falling. And once again, graceful curves. Now, Mary has a very idealized face. It very much resembles classical statues in some ways, and I'll give you a detail so you can see that in just a bit. Elizabeth is an old woman. And so in a sense, what we're doing is showing two aspects of classical influence. The idealistic figure, and the Romans often would do very naturalistic portraiture. So here we have a figure that actually looks like an older woman. And of course that emphasizes part of the meaning of this. So, she's in her old age, she's become pregnant with John the Baptist. It's a kind of miracle, the same kind of miracle that was told in the Old Testament with Sarah and Hannah, both older women who gave birth to a child in their old age. It was miraculous. And here we're looking at the Virgin Mary. And you can see she has this sort of rounded jaw. And I'll take a look at the the hairstyle, where it's parted in the middle and falls in these waves to either side. And then she has the cloak, the veil, up over her head. Well, this does resemble, a classical statuary. I found a classical head here that has some of the same characteristics. You can see how the hairstyle is shown, and even the way the folds are carved. There's a similarity. It seems quite, I would say, beyond likely, beyond doubt, that the artist who carved these had seen some classical statues. We can't identify the source as a particular statue that probably doesn't exist anymore. But when you look at this, Mary showing the idealism of classical art, Elizabeth showing the naturalistic features of the Roman portrait, the draperies that wrap the body and cling to the body, it seems the artist must have seen and emulated some of these characteristics from classical statues. As classicizing as these two figures work, there's a few details that give them away as medieval work. You wouldn't mistake them as real Roman statues, although they share some characteristics of Roman statues. For example, the proportions are not quite to the classical ideal. And the artist's interest in the drapery folds, the articulation of the drapery, is probably stronger than his understanding of anatomy. You might notice that upraised arm of Elizabeth. The hand has broken off over the years. But even with the draperies, wrapping the arm, it's not as anatomically articulated as a genuine classical statue. It's more tubular. Now, it's not as tubular as an Ottonian or a Romanesque figure. It's more realistic than that. But, a Roman sculptor would understand more about anatomy. Let's look at the jambs on the north side of the central portal of the west facade. These four figures tell us the story of the presentation of Christ in the temple. And here, since we're looking at it a little bit from the side, you can see that the statues literally are standing in front of the jamb statues, in front of the walls. They're not part of the wall or part of the column. They're standing completely on their little plinths, and they're independent of the shape of the column. The figures are St. Joseph, and you see Joseph here in a detail. Mary, who is holding the baby Jesus. Simeon, who is this old man who has been told by God that he will not die until he sees the Savior. And when he sees the Christ child, he says, now, was the nunc dimittas, now let thy servant depart in peace according to thy word, because he's seen the Savior. And he prophesies. And then there is another figure. It could have been the prophetess Anna, but she's an old woman once again. So this is a young woman. So presumably this is Mary's maidservant. Now, have you picked up on the fact that we're looking at two different artists once again? And they're two different artists whom you've already seen their work. Mary and Simeon seem to be carved by the same hand or the same workshop that carved the Virgin Annunciate at Reims. And here, an Annunciation at Amiens. So, is this the same person, or is it the same workshop? Someone's been trained in the same traditions. And so Here, look at the similarities of the facial types, the shape of the eyes, the carving of the hair between these three different figures. You've got Simeon, you've got the maidservant, you've got Mary, and there's a great deal of similarity. You'll notice when we're looking at the presentation, the Virgin Mary, and of course the Christ child has been damaged. You may be looking for him. You only see the bottom part of him. He's lost his head and part of the top of his body. But there's Mary holding the Christ child, and then she's got that same deep V in her tunic that the Virgin Annunciate had. Simeon has the same shaped eyes and parallel wavy grooves in his beard that define the hair of the two Marys. And then we compare them to the Annunciation by the Amiens master. We see that Mary has the same profile. She has the same veil. The Amiens work is a bit stiffer. It's a little bit more patterned. It might be, as we say, it might be different people working in the workshop, or it even could be the same hand, because it's earlier, and the artist then improves his techniques by the time he comes to Reims. Or it could be another artist who had trained in the Amiens workshop and then comes to Reims, and there are some differences. But there's a lot of similarities. Okay, now we want to look at St. Joseph and the maidservant. And I'm comparing St. Joseph here to the smiling angel of the central Tibida that originally was on the north. I'm sorry, the central port, the smiling angel of the central portal. So just on the other side of the portal. And you'll notice, particularly since these photographs are taken from the same angle, that the heads are very similar. They project out on these necks at the same point. Joseph's got a beard, but his cheekbones rise up in the same way. St. Joseph repeats the same winsome grin. It's a little obscured by his mustache and beard, but you can see the cheeks. His neck and head jut out from the wall at precisely the same angle as the angel's head and neck do. And the artist who has created these goes by two different names. Now, when we don't know an artist's name, but we can identify his style, and we can find his style in different works, we often give them a conventional name. It's usually named after a work of art that they've done, or some characteristic of that art. There's even some where, if there's a dated painting, for example, they might name the artist after that date. But in this case, it's after works of art. And he's called either the Joseph Master or the Smiling Angel Master. And he seems also to have carved the maidservant. The maid's cloak follows the same lines as the angel's, clinging tightly to the upper arm and then pulled in a graceful fold over one hip with the hems cascading down. And all three poses, Joseph, the maidservant, the angel, they're very similar poses. They have a slight twist to the body and the raised hip. The eyes are almond shaped. They have these tightly curling locks of hair, and the other features resemble each other. So here we can compare Joseph and the maidservant on either side with two pictures of the same smiling angel, who's now the angel Gabriel in the Annunciation. And you can look at the garment that the maidservant is wearing. It looks like she's borrowed the angel's cloak. Actually, they come up in the same way. They fasten the same way. There's just so many similarities.